Imagine an empire so powerful, so disciplined that its armies seemed unbeatable. Rome's legions marched across continents, crushing enemies and leaving behind a trail of conquered lands. Yet, hidden within Rome's greatest strength was a fatal weakness. In teaching others its methods of war, Rome unknowingly armed its future destroyers. This is the untold story of how Rome's own tactics, once feared by the world, were turned against the empire itself. The Roman military was not just a fighting force. It was the very foundation of the empire's success. From the earliest days of the Republic to the height of the imperial era, the legions embodied the strength, discipline, and order that Rome was known for. A Roman soldier did not simply pick up a sword and march into battle. His entire life was shaped by rigorous training that demanded precision, endurance, and absolute loyalty to the state. Days were spent drilling in formation, marching long distances in full armor, and practicing the use of weapons until every movement became second nature. What set the Roman army apart from others was this commitment to discipline over chaos. While other cultures often relied on raw courage and individual heroics, Rome turned warfare into an art of coordination and control. Every man knew his place in the line. Every shield overlapped with the one beside it, and every formation moved like the gears of a great machine. This extraordinary system of training was the reason Rome could stretch its power across continents. From Britain to the deserts of the Middle East, the legions carried the Roman way of war wherever they went. But Rome did not stop at training its own. As the empire expanded, the need for soldiers grew beyond what the Roman citizenry could provide. To fill the ranks, Rome turned to conquered peoples and allies. These men, known as auxiliaries, were brought into the army to serve alongside the legions. On the surface, this seemed like a clever solution. Rome gained more manpower, and the auxiliaries gained the chance to earn citizenship, wealth, or prestige. It was a system that appeared to benefit both sides. But in giving auxiliaries access to its methods, Rome was unknowingly sharing something far more valuable than citizenship or coin. It was opening the door to its greatest military secrets. Auxiliaries were not simply treated as expendable troops thrown into the front lines. They were taught how to march in step, how to build Roman-style camps with defensive walls and ditches, how to fight in coordinated formations, and even how to use complex siege machinery. These lessons were meant to make the auxiliaries more effective in service to Rome, but the knowledge they gained was not left behind when their time in the legions ended. When these men returned to their homelands, they carried with them the training and discipline that had once made the Roman army unmatched. Many would remain loyal allies, using their skills to defend Rome's borders. Yet others, whether driven by resentment, ambition, or the lure of independence, would share those skills with their own people. Tribes that had once charged recklessly into battle now began to understand the value of formations, discipline, and strategy. The difference was subtle at first, but over time it grew into a significant threat. For Rome, this was the beginning of a dangerous paradox. The very system that had allowed it to dominate the ancient world also planted the seeds of its vulnerability. By spreading its methods too widely, Rome was teaching outsiders how to fight like Romans. And once those outsiders no longer had reason to serve the empire, the knowledge they possessed became a weapon that could be turned against it. The legions remained powerful, but the empire had unknowingly given its enemies the tools to challenge them on equal footing. The rise of Roman military training was a story of brilliance and foresight, but it was also a story of short-sightedness. Rome believed that discipline and order could be imposed on anyone, that outsiders could be shaped into loyal defenders of the empire. What it did not see was that these outsiders were also learning how to become independent powers in their own right. Every auxiliary drilled in Roman style was a reminder that Rome's greatest advantage, its unmatched military system, was no longer its alone to wield. This was the first step in a slow but inevitable reversal. Rome had built an empire on discipline, and in doing so it had unknowingly begun to create enemies who could match that very discipline. The legions remained formidable, but the seeds of their future struggles had already been sown in the training fields of the empire itself. Auxiliaries stood at the very heart of Rome's military strategy, yet they were never truly Roman. Drawn from conquered territories and allied tribes, they came from the mountains, forests, and plains beyond the empire's heartland. For Rome, auxiliaries solved a pressing problem. There were not enough Roman citizens to fill the ever-growing demand for soldiers as the empire stretched across 3 continents. By recruiting outsiders, Rome could reinforce its legions without overburdening its own population. But with this solution came an unintended consequence. These foreign recruits, men once hostile to Rome, were welcomed into its armies, taught its ways, and immersed in its methods of war. In doing so, Rome was not only strengthening itself, it was also arming those who might one day break free from its grip. The auxiliaries were trained in the same camps as the legions. They learned how to build fortified encampments overnight, complete with ditches, ramparts, and watchtowers. They practiced maneuvers on the drill fields, marching in unison with the same precision as Roman soldiers. They studied the art of constructing siege engines and using them effectively in battle. Even their weapons and armor often mirrored that of the legions, though sometimes adapted to include their native styles. These men came to embody a blend of Roman discipline and local traditions, a combination that would prove both effective and dangerous. Rome saw them as tools to be used in its service, but each auxiliary was also a carrier of knowledge, absorbing techniques that once gave Rome its unmatched edge. The promise of Roman citizenship after years of loyal service made the role appealing to many. Some auxiliaries fought with great devotion, defending the empire's borders from external threats. Yet not all were bound by loyalty. For every man who pledged his life to Rome, there were others who looked upon their training as an opportunity, a chance to take Rome's secrets back to their own people. Once discharged, auxiliaries returned home with a mastery of organized warfare. No longer did their tribes need to rely solely on courage and improvisation. They now understood how to fight in formations, how to coordinate cavalry charges, and how to maintain discipline under pressure. This was not just knowledge, it was power. Consider the Goths, the Franks, and other tribal groups. For centuries, they had resisted Rome with fierce independence, but lacked the structure to overcome its legions. The presence of auxiliaries changed that balance. Former soldiers introduced Roman methods into tribal warfare, teaching their kin how to build defenses, lay ambushes, and even construct siege engines. Villages that had once scattered before a marching legion now had the means to stand firm, to fight like the enemy they once feared. Rome thought it was creating allies. In truth, it was creating imitators. Imitators who were growing stronger with every passing year. The transformation was gradual, but the danger became more visible as the empire faced uprisings and invasions led by tribes who fought with uncanny Roman efficiency. What once gave the legions a decisive advantage was no longer unique to them. Rome's enemies could now anticipate its moves, counter its strategies, and even outmaneuver its generals. This shift was no accident. It was the direct result of Rome's reliance on auxiliaries. By training outsiders in the very core of Roman military science, the empire had planted seeds of rebellion across its borders. The transfer of knowledge through auxiliaries highlights one of the great paradoxes of Rome. The empire prided itself on assimilation, believing that conquered peoples could be molded into loyal subjects. In many cases, this worked. Entire provinces became Romanized, adopting the language, laws, and culture of the empire. But military knowledge was different. While language and culture tied people closer to Rome, military training gave them the ability to resist it. The auxiliaries represented both integration and independence. They were a reminder that every lesson taught to strengthen the empire also risked equipping its rivals. Rome, in its ambition to dominate, underestimated the long-term cost of sharing its methods so freely. The auxiliaries were not merely mercenaries, they were students of Rome. And once their service ended, they became teachers to their own people. Through them, the very essence of Roman warfare spread far beyond the empire's control, until one day it came back, sharpened and ready to be used against the hand that had once guided it. The tribes beyond Rome's borders had long been known for their ferocity. The Goths, the Franks, the Vandals, and countless others fought with a raw, unrestrained energy that terrified their enemies. But for centuries, this very energy was also their weakness. They lacked unity, discipline, and the ability to sustain prolonged campaigns against a power as organized as Rome. The legions thrived because of coordination. The tribes faltered because of disarray. Yet once these same tribes came into contact with Roman training, whether through auxiliary service, captured deserters, or prolonged exposure to Roman methods, the balance began to change. The barbarians were no longer simply fierce. They were becoming organized. Imagine a battlefield where the wild rush of tribal warriors suddenly held steady in formation. Instead of breaking ranks after their first charge, they stood shoulder to shoulder, shields interlocked, spears thrusting in unison. This was no longer the chaotic onslaught Rome had always known how to counter. It was a mirror of Rome's own tactics reflected back against them. The very system that had allowed the legions to conquer was now in the hands of those once considered too primitive to wield it. The Goths were among the first to adapt. For decades, many had served as foederati, federated allies who fought under Roman command. In doing so, they absorbed not only the discipline of the legions, but also the logic behind their strategies. When they eventually turned against Rome, the Goths no longer resembled the scattered warriors of old. They moved with cohesion, struck with precision, and used cavalry and infantry in a coordinated manner that stunned the legions. Rome was not just fighting barbarians anymore. It was fighting soldiers who had once been their comrades in arms. The Franks too learned from their exposure to Rome. Once a loose confederation of tribes, they began adopting fortified camps, a distinctly Roman practice. No longer were they content with hit-and-run raids. They laid sieges, constructed defenses, and planned campaigns that lasted months instead of days. Rome's borders along the Rhine, once secured by the sheer discipline of its legions, now faced opponents who understood exactly how those defenses worked and how to exploit them. The Vandals would go even further. When they crossed into Roman territory, they did not simply loot and withdraw. They organized planned migrations and eventually executed full-scale invasions. By the time they crossed into North Africa, one of the empire's richest provinces, they were not acting like wandering raiders, but like a structured force capable of seizing and holding territory. They had learned from the empire how to conquer and rule, and now they applied those lessons to carve out their own domains. This transformation of Rome's enemies was one of the greatest unintended consequences of its military system. Rome believed its methods were unshakable, uniquely its own, and impossible to duplicate. But discipline is not a secret. It is a skill. Once observed, once taught, it could spread. And once spread, it could not be taken back. The tribes who had once been scattered and disorganized were now imitating the very machine that had subdued them. In time, some of these groups became so adept at Roman-style warfare that they were virtually indistinguishable from the legions they opposed. For the Romans, this shift was deeply unsettling. It meant that their enemies could anticipate Roman tactics before they were executed. A Roman commander could no longer rely on the certainty that the enemy would break under pressure. Instead, he had to watch as barbarians held their lines, counterattacked with precision, or launched sieges that once only Rome was capable of. The legions, once unrivaled, now faced a reflection of themselves on the battlefield, a reflection that grew stronger with every encounter. What made this change even more dangerous was that these tribes did not abandon their own strengths. They did not simply copy Rome. They combined Roman discipline with their own natural ferocity and mobility. The result was an enemy that could adapt quickly, fight with both endurance and aggression, and exploit weaknesses that traditional tribal warfare would never have noticed. In many ways, this hybrid style was more flexible than Rome's own rigid system, giving the tribes an edge in battles where creativity and surprise could determine the outcome. The emergence of barbarians trained in Roman tactics marked a turning point in history. Rome had once held a monopoly on discipline and strategy, but now its enemies were using that very knowledge to challenge its supremacy. The transformation was slow, but it was undeniable. The legions that had conquered the world now faced opponents who were not only their equals, but in some cases their betters. What had once been Rome's greatest strength was becoming the weapon of its downfall. The year 378 AD marked one of the darkest chapters in Rome's long military history, a moment when its own brilliance was turned against it. The Battle of Adrianople was not just another clash between legions and tribes. It was the day the Roman Empire learned that the enemies it had once trained were now capable of defeating it on the field of battle. This was more than a loss. It was a shockwave that echoed across the empire and revealed a dangerous truth. Rome's enemies no longer fought as scattered tribes, but as disciplined forces who had mastered Roman tactics. The story began when the Goths, pressured by the relentless advance of the Huns, sought refuge inside Roman territory. At first, they were accepted as allies, their warriors enrolled as foederati under Rome's banner. Yet Rome mishandled this alliance, treating the Goths with cruelty and corruption. Hungry, mistreated, and desperate, they rebelled. What followed was not a reckless uprising, but an organized campaign led by men who had once served alongside the legions. They knew Rome's strengths, but more importantly, they understood its weaknesses. When Emperor Valens marched out to confront them, he underestimated his opponents. To him, the Goths were still barbarians, fierce, yes, but disorganized and untrained. He believed his legions would crush them as Rome had always done. What he did not see was that these Goths had learned from the empire itself. They knew how to set traps, how to coordinate cavalry with infantry, and how to turn patience into a weapon. On that fateful August day, the legions advanced into the heat of battle, unaware that the Goths had hidden their cavalry, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Roman infantry clashed with Gothic warriors who stood firm in their lines, fighting not with the wild abandon of the past, but with the discipline of seasoned soldiers. As the Romans pressed forward, the hidden Gothic cavalry swept around and struck the flanks, encircling the legions in a devastating trap. It was a maneuver Rome itself had perfected countless times, but now it was used against them with brutal efficiency. The result was catastrophic. The Roman army was overwhelmed, crushed in the very style of battle it had once dominated. Tens of thousands of soldiers were slain, and the emperor himself, Valens, fell in the chaos. His body was never found, a haunting symbol of Rome's humiliation. Adrianople was not just a military defeat, it was a revelation. The legions, once considered invincible, had been destroyed by an enemy that had mastered Rome's own methods. The psychological impact of this battle was immense. For centuries, the legions had been the pride of the empire, their discipline and tactics unmatched across the known world. But now Rome was forced to face a new reality. The monopoly on military excellence was over. The Goths had proven that they could fight Rome on equal terms and win. No longer were they the disorganized raiders of old. They were soldiers who had learned from the very empire they sought to bring down. The Battle of Adrianople shattered Rome's aura of invincibility. It exposed the empire's over-reliance on auxiliaries and foederati, the very channels through which its knowledge had spread. It also revealed the danger of arrogance, as Roman leaders continued to dismiss their enemies as inferior long after they had demonstrated otherwise. Adrianople was a warning sign, a glimpse of the struggles to come as more and more tribes adopted Roman tactics and turned them against their former masters. In the years that followed, the lesson of Adrianople was repeated time and again. The tribes of Europe had discovered a deadly balance. Their own natural ferocity combined with Roman discipline created an army that Rome itself struggled to match. Adrianople marked the beginning of a new age, one in which Rome no longer dictated the terms of battle, but instead fought desperately to survive against enemies who were, in many ways, its own creation. This battle stands as a turning point in history. It was not just the loss of soldiers or the death of an emperor. It was the moment when Rome realized that the world had changed. The tactics that had built an empire could no longer guarantee its survival, because those tactics no longer belonged to Rome alone. They had been adopted, adapted, and ultimately perfected by the very people who sought to tear the empire apart. The aftermath of Adrianople did not just weaken Rome on the battlefield, it weakened the very fabric of the empire itself. For centuries, the Roman military system had been the spine of its power, the institution that allowed emperors to rule vast territories and maintain control over restless provinces. Yet by the late 4th and 5th centuries, cracks were spreading through this once unshakable structure. The battle losses were devastating, but the deeper wound came from the way Rome had tied its survival to the very groups that would one day bring it down. Rome's population was shrinking, and the demands of defending such enormous borders required more soldiers than the empire could supply. Recruiting Germans, Goths, and other tribes appeared to fill the gaps. These men fought bravely, and in many cases Rome benefited from their skill and courage. But there was a dangerous price. The empire was no longer filled with legions raised from its own citizens, bound by the discipline and traditions of Rome. Instead, its armies were now filled with men whose ultimate loyalty lay not to Rome itself, but to their own chieftains and tribes. This shift slowly eroded the unity of the legions. Once the legionnaire had been a symbol of order, trained, disciplined, and committed to a cause greater than himself. But foederati did not fight for Rome's glory. They fought for the promises of land, plunder, or political advantage. Their commanders, often of non-Roman birth, held influence not because of Roman law but because of the loyalty of their warriors. Over time, Rome's own military command was undermined. Generals became dependent on tribal leaders, and in many cases, emperors themselves were forced to bargain with these men, treating them less like subjects and more like partners in power. This dependency created a cycle that Rome could not escape. Each time the empire faced a new crisis, be it invasion, rebellion, or civil war, it turned again to the tribes, giving them more privileges, more land, and more control within Roman borders. What began as a temporary solution turned into a dangerous reliance. And every time Rome leaned on these groups, the balance of power tilted further away from the empire and toward the very people who had once been considered barbarians. The consequences became clear as the 5th century unfolded. Tribal leaders like Alaric the Goth rose not as mere allies, but as power brokers who could dictate terms to Rome itself. Alaric, once a Roman officer, used his knowledge of Roman military structures to press his advantage. His Gothic warriors were not an outside threat crashing against Rome's walls. They were inside, woven into the empire's own defenses. When negotiations failed, Alaric and his forces marched on Rome, culminating in the shocking sack of the city in 410 AD. It was the first time in 800 years that Rome itself had fallen to an enemy, and the psychological impact was enormous. What made this disaster so haunting was the way Rome had prepared its own downfall. The empire had armed, trained, and entrusted the very forces that now stormed its gates. By allowing outsiders into the military system, Rome had surrendered its most sacred advantage, the discipline and unity of its legions. The barbarians who once fought as scattered warbands now wielded the empire's own tactics, equipment, and strategies against it. The fall of Rome was not the result of an enemy too powerful to resist. It was the result of Rome giving away the tools of its own survival. The reliance on foederati also undermined Roman identity. In earlier centuries, military service had been a mark of citizenship, a duty and privilege that tied the individual to the empire. But as more foreign soldiers filled the ranks, the bond between army and state weakened. Many Roman citizens no longer felt the same duty to serve, relying instead on outsiders to fight in their place. This cultural shift hollowed out the empire from within. It no longer had the same strength of shared purpose that had once united it, and without that cohesion, its resilience faded. By the time the Western Empire staggered into its final decades, it was no longer the Rome of Caesar or Augustus. Its armies were fractured, its generals divided, and its enemies all too familiar with Roman ways of war. The empire had created a mirror image of itself in the tribes, but without the same loyalty to a central authority. The mirror turned into a weapon, reflecting Rome's own brilliance back upon it in the most destructive way. Thus, the decline of Rome was not simply a story of enemies pressing in from beyond the borders. It was the story of an empire that, through desperation and short-sighted decisions, taught its foes everything they needed to know to bring it down. The reliance on foederati, born out of necessity, transformed into the very engine of Rome's collapse. The empire's greatest strength, its unmatched military system, was slowly given away until it no longer belonged to Rome alone. By the twilight of the Western Roman Empire, the full weight of centuries of decisions came crashing down, and nowhere was this more visible than in the way Rome's tactics and alliances finally turned against it. What had begun as a clever strategy to use foreign strength to supplement Roman weaknesses had spiraled into a dependence that left the empire vulnerable to forces it could no longer control. By the late 5th century, Rome was no longer the master of its own armies. It had become a pawn in the ambitions of men who were once considered outsiders. The empire that had trained others in the arts of war now stood exposed to those very same arts, wielded against it with devastating precision. One of the clearest signs of this reversal came in the figure of Odoacer, a Germanic leader who rose through the ranks of the foederati. Like Alaric before him, Odoacer's path to power was paved by Rome itself. He and his men served Rome faithfully for years, learning the organization, strategies, and weaknesses of the empire firsthand. But loyalty was fragile, and by the time Odoacer's ambitions could no longer be contained, Rome had no native strength left to resist him. In 476 AD, Odoacer deposed the young emperor Romulus Augustulus, a boy emperor whose very name seemed to echo the grandeur of Rome's beginnings. With this act, the Western Roman Empire officially fell, not to a foreign invasion but to one of its own generals, trained in Rome's ways, commanding an army that had once fought under the imperial banner. This was the tragic irony of Rome's final chapter. For centuries, the empire had defined itself through military supremacy. It had crushed Carthage, subdued Greece, conquered Gaul, and fought off countless enemies on its borders. Yet in its decline, it was not external enemies that toppled the empire, but the very men it had welcomed, trained, and armed. Rome had given them the tools, the strategies, and the confidence to build power of their own. The empire that once dictated the rules of war now found itself subject to those rules, outmaneuvered by those who had once studied beneath its shadow. The fall of the Western Empire revealed just how much Rome had changed. Once, discipline and loyalty defined the Roman legions, but by the 5th century, those ideals were little more than memory. Armies were no longer bound to the state. They were bound to the fortunes of generals or tribal kings. Soldiers no longer fought for the dream of Rome. They fought for gold, land, or survival. The unity that had carried Rome through its greatest triumphs was gone, replaced by a fractured landscape where allegiances shifted with every promise. This was not just the loss of power, it was the loss of identity. And yet the lessons Rome had passed on would outlive it. The tribes who once seemed disorganized and scattered now carried with them the organizational genius of Rome's military machine. They learned to build fortifications, to march in order, to coordinate cavalry and infantry, to use logistics as weapons of war. These lessons shaped the kingdoms that rose in the wake of Rome's collapse. The Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and eventually the Franks all carried fragments of Rome with them, ensuring that while the empire fell, its legacy could never be erased. In a way, Rome achieved an immortality it could not have foreseen. By spreading its knowledge to those who would destroy it, it ensured that its influence lived on in the very forces that tore it apart. The story of Rome's fall, therefore, is not simply about defeat. It is about how power breeds imitation, how strength inspires rivals, and how even the mightiest empire can teach its enemies to become something greater. Rome's brilliance was so profound that even in collapse, it passed on the flame of civilization to those who had once been branded barbarians. The irony is that this passing of knowledge, done often in desperation or short-sightedness, hastened its own end. But without it, the world that came after Rome would have been far darker, less ordered, and less advanced. By the time the Western Empire fell in 476 AD, Rome had already secured its place in history. Its enemies may have carried away its treasures, its armies may have been scattered, and its emperors may have faded into irrelevance. But the very tactics that had once brought it glory continued to shape Europe for centuries. In training its enemies, Rome sowed the seeds of its own destruction, but it also sowed the seeds of the medieval kingdoms that would carry forward the echoes of Rome's greatness. Thus, the final keynote is not only about defeat, it is about legacy. Rome's downfall was tragic, yes, but it was also transformative. The empire may have crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions, but in doing so, it gave birth to a new world, forged in the lessons of its rise and fall. Rome trained its enemies, and those enemies destroyed it. But in that destruction, the Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, and countless others learned from Rome, sharpened their blades with Roman steel, and mastered tactics forged by Roman discipline. And when the time came, they turned those lessons back on the empire that had once seemed immortal. Yet Rome's fall is not only a tale of defeat, it is also a story of survival through transformation. Even as the Western Empire collapsed in 476 AD, the knowledge Rome had shared continued to shape the world. Its roads became the foundations of trade, its laws became the backbone of justice, and its military genius continued to guide kingdoms for centuries. Rome died at the hands of its own creations, but it also lived on through them. This is the true irony of history. Rome trained its enemies and they destroyed it. But in doing so, they carried forward the very flame Rome had lit. The empire may have fallen, but its shadow still stretches across our world, a reminder that even in destruction, greatness leaves a legacy.